don't want their kids to hear.
Yes. Yeah. That'd be an interesting dynamic. So
Good to see you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I imagine we will have a few more come in, but I want to go ahead and get started. I am, as was I mentioned last week, so grateful. Yeah, we've got Peter all the way up there. And do I want to stop my video here or just leave that on? What do you think? We just leave that on, don't you think?
Yeah, that's fine. Here, I
What
can
we
just
can
minimize
do,
it up
minimize that.
here.
Yeah.
Right here. Better
Good.
yet?
Yeah.
It'll just
There,
show up here.
that's what we want.
Okay.
Great. Welcome to those who are here and also to those who are zooming in. I see that the walk-ups are with us, so I want to say a word of hello to Knox and Betsy. I'm really grateful that you all are here. This is the second week. Peter was with us last week and I thought did a wonderful job talking about a racially inclusive democracy. How do we get there? And really, how do we live into the promise of our founding documents? But one of the ways we need to do that is to see how we have fallen short from that promise early on. And so today we're going to continue that conversation about imagining a more inclusive and pluralistic future. I said last week that Peter and I were seminary classmates. He ended up going on and doing doctoral work and becoming a professor out in Iowa, which is really crazy to me that Donovan doesn't know him personally, as much as Donovan likes to talk about Iowa, but maybe that will happen. But Greg and Marilyn Cornish were members of church with Peter and his wife and got to know his kids. And I've kind of reconnected with him through Facebook. And Marilyn wrote, "How do you guys know one another?" And that was kind of a beginning of a wonderful conversation. But it's been a real delight for me to introduce you all to Peter and have Peter give up 2 Sundays to teach for us. So Peter, welcome. Thank you so much. Let me turn the class over to you now.
I'm glad to be with you again. So last week I did kind of a long slog through American history, kind of chronicling some of the ways in which we've maybe failed to live up to the promises of our founding documents. And today I'd like to kind of comment on what kind of work needs to be done and what kind of thinking I think needs to be done in order to have a more inclusive, pluralistic future. And I think I've divided this up. I think I have like 11 main points that I want to talk about today. I was trying to narrow it down to my top 10 list, but I ended up with 11, so you'll have to stick with that. So I think the first thing we have to do, and that's why I spent some time on the history last week, was in order to move forward toward a more inclusive, pluralistic, multiracial democracy, toward a more perfect union, as it were, we need to be honest. We need to be honest about our nation's past. So we need to insist on telling the truth about our nation's history. And this includes grappling with what I said last week was, the contradiction at the heart of America's founding, and the contradiction at the heart of its self-understanding throughout much of its history. We celebrate the lofty and worthy ideal that all people are created equal, that they have the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet, in this so-called democracy, some people were deemed unworthy of inclusion due to the color of their skin. So it's almost as if we need a kind of truth and reconciliation committee, right? You really can't have reconciliation without the truth. And as Eddie Glaude from Princeton has said, accepting the reality of our country's racist past and present will help us better understand the distorted nature of who we take ourselves to be. Our actual democracy is less than 60 years old since the passing of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, 64 and 1965. It's been less than 60 years since both women and African Americans were granted the right to vote. And most Americans are in agreement with me. I take encouragement from this, that we need to be honest about our nation's past. According to a public religion research poll from 2023, 94% of Americans agreed that we should teach our children both the good and bad aspects of our history so that they can learn from the past. And 75%, according to this poll, 75% agreed that public school teachers and librarians are professionals whom we should trust to provide our kids with appropriate curriculum and books that teach the good and bad of American history. Most Americans aren't for banning of books. They're completely okay with exposing our children to stories that run counter to some of the dominant narratives. Only 22% of Americans believe that public school teachers and librarians should not be allowed to develop curriculum and teach books that wrongly portray America as a racist country. So I take encouragement from the fact that the majority of Americans say that, no, we need to be honest about this past of ours. Second, I think we need to fight against the propaganda of certain purveyors of patriotic history, what they call patriotic history, that distorts the past in the service of a narrative that simply exalts heroic figures engaged in the onward march of American progress. We shouldn't promote what Frederick Douglass has called the apostles of forgetfulness, people who promote the lie about our past in order to maintain white innocence. And again, I draw upon Eddie Glaude. He's formed my thinking on this in so many ways. He wrote a book recently called Begin Again, James Baldwin's, I shouldn't have that apostrophe S, James Baldwin's America and its Urgent Lessons for Our Own. And in it, Glaude says, if the condition of the love of country is a lie, the love itself, no matter how genuine, is a lie. It disfigures who we are because we engage in self-deceit. In the end, we have to free ourselves of the hold and allure of such a self-deceiving love, because that is the only way we can imagine ourselves anew and love truly. And again, most Americans are in agreement that when it comes to the teaching of American history, we should include both our best achievements and our worst mistakes as a country. We shouldn't just be teaching just the best parts of it, a kind of patriotic history, as it were, right? So 84% of Americans are in agreement here. And there's not much of a partisan divide. I take encouragement from this. There's not much of a partisan divide in terms of we should be teaching a history that includes both the good and the bad, rather than simply focusing on what makes this nation great or exceptional. Third, we should counter the narrative of white Christian nationalism. White Christian nationalism is an ideology that argues that America was founded as a Christian nation upon Christian principles, that America was divinely chosen and given a special purpose by God in the world, that Christians, especially white Christians, should have a privileged place, that they should rule over the others, and that government should privilege basically Christianity. And there are certain purveyors of this narrative. There's a man by the name of David Barton. Maybe some of you have heard of him from Texas. He's not a trained historian, but he's a very popular kind of pseudo historian who perpetuates this mythology that is the favored mythology of white Christian nationalists. When we look at our nation's founding, our founding documents like the Declaration of Independence, there are references to God in the Declaration of Independence. God is referred to as the supreme judge. There's a reference to the creator. There's a reference to the protection of divine providence. There are appeals to the sovereignty of God. But these references that Thomas Jefferson made are very consistent with a kind of deistic notion of God. And Thomas Jefferson was not some kind of evangelical Christian. He was a sharp critic of traditional Christianity. He was a deist. There are, in the Declaration of Independence, there are no references to Jesus Christ or specifically Christian ideas, nor are there any Bible references, in spite of what a lot of Americans think. And when we go to the U.S. Constitution, when I teach my classes on American history, I sometimes like to ask my students, is there a reference to God in the U.S. Constitution? And typically a majority of them raise their hands. There is not one reference to God in our Constitution. And this is very different from many of the state constitutions at this time, in which there are lots of references to God. But when we look at the U.S. Constitution, I'm struck by how secular of a document it is. Our founding fathers were political pragmatists. It was going to be hard enough to get the representatives of 13 states to come together to agree upon a constitution. I mean, slavery was such a pivotal issue in this regard. And so many of them thought that it's better not to inject religion into our Constitution, right? That's just going to, raise a whole new can of worms. And also many of them were Federalists. They believed that religion was best a matter to be left to the states. So in our original Constitution of 1787, there's only one explicit reference to religion, and that's Article 6. There shall be no religious test for public office. This does not support the case that government should privilege Christianity, right? No religious test for public office. Then 2 years later, when we added the Bill of Rights, we added the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Thomas Jefferson later on in a letter to a Baptist church in Danbury, Connecticut, read this as we basically erected a wall of separation between church and state. Now that metaphor is not in the Constitution, but certainly there were a lot of founding fathers who saw it in terms of that metaphor. And then by 1797, in the Treaty of Tripoli, our government staked out the principle, and I quote, "The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded in the Christian religion." So we should reject this narrative that in some way the United States was founded as a specifically Christian nation. Maybe the majority of citizens were Christian, and maybe certain Christian ideas were privileged as we move through our nation's history. But I would argue that we were not founded specifically as a Christian nation. Fourth, we need to resist the temptation to think of U.S. history as one of extraordinary progress toward a more perfect union. I think a lot of Americans like to imagine this, especially white Americans. They like to think that, yes, we made mistakes along the way, but now we've corrected them. Slavery was obviously bad. Jim Crow was bad. Lynching was bad. But look at how far we've come. Look at all the accomplishments of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. Look at the election of Barack Obama. We're constantly improving. This must be proof that we're no longer a racist nation. We all have equal opportunity now. Well, history is not always linear, especially when it comes to racial progress. Our nation's history has borne witness to patterns of racial progress and racist reaction. And this was kind of the theme of my talk last week. Racial progress is often met with racist reaction. We had the racial progress of Reconstruction and the racist reaction of Jim Crow. We had the racial progress of the Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s, and the racist reaction of law and order political campaigns and mass incarceration of African Americans. We had the racial progress of the election of Barack Obama, but I would argue that the election of Donald Trump was in part a racist reaction to Barack Obama. Has there been progress? Definitely. But this should not blind us to the work that still needs to be done. And there's somewhat of a divide among Americans today in terms of the kind of progress we've made in achieving true equality. So 42% of Americans, according to this poll from a few years ago, agreed with that statement, but 55%, a majority say, no, we haven't made great progress. And there's a kind of a theme here. Often it's, there's quite a significant partisan divide. 56% of Republicans think we've made great progress, whereas only 29% of Democrats agree. And this is in part reflective of their bases. I mean, Republicans draw from a largely white base. Democrats draw from a far more pluralistic kind of multiracial base. And so, and we see it with this divide between, say, Black Protestants. 70% of Black Protestants disagree with the statement that we've made great progress, racial progress, whereas only 45% of white evangelicals disagree with that statement. So we see this kind of partisan divide, and those who tend to agree that we've made great progress would also then be the ones who insist that we have a level playing field today, right? And that we shouldn't be taking steps to try to make even greater progress. Fifth, I think we need to understand how the past shapes the present, especially regarding those who have been historically marginalized. We need to look back in order to understand the choices we've made that have brought us to this present moment of crisis. I think there's a real danger in thinking that everything is fine now. This causes us to become blind to present realities on account of our history. But as James Baldwin once said, the past is not past. History is literally present in all we do. I'll say that again. History is literally present in all we do. So we need to stand with and listen to those on the margins of society. And this takes empathy in order to view our country through their eyes. As a white American, I think I need to do more, and I've been doing this in the last several years. I need to do more listening to African Americans to understand how our history has literally shaped their situation to this very day. As the late cultural critic Edward Said put it, it entails moving away from the centralizing authorities toward the margins, where you see things that are usually lost on minds that have never traveled beyond the conventional and the comfortable, right? So we need to shift our thinking. We need to move away from centralizing authorities and move towards the margins and start to listen to their stories. And this will probably mean being willing to become uncomfortable, to get out of our comfort zones, and then eventually to advocate for policies that address those circumstances. Again, there's a significant partisan divide over this issue that shapes the kind of policies advocated for, advocated by our two political parties. So when people are asked the question, generations of slavery and discrimination created conditions that make it difficult for Black Americans to work their way out of the lower class. 45% of Americans were in agreement, whereas 51% disagreed. But again, we see a significant partisan divide here. 72% of Democrats agreed, 16% of Republicans agreed. And of course, independents are right there in the middle, as we would expect. But again, there's a significant racial divide as well. Only 38% of white Americans agree with that statement, whereas 75% of Black Americans agree with that statement. I think white Americans need to do a better job of listening to the experiences of Black Americans to understand how generations of discrimination have made it far more difficult for them than for the average white American. When we look at this question in terms of the religious categories, here we have only 19% of white evangelical Protestants agree. Right? That's been kind of the Trump base. White evangelical Protestants, over 80% voted for him. And there's a significant divide then. 78% of Black Protestants agree with that statement. But again, it's not just a religious divide. There's this racial divide. Among white mainline Protestants, only 36% agree with this statement, that generations of discrimination have made it more difficult for Black Americans. Sixth, how am I doing on time? Oh, I think I'm going to be okay. I think we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for some questions. We need to think about racism not only as an individual matter, but as a systemic problem. Many Americans, especially white Americans, prefer to think of racism as an individual matter. They easily condemn acts of individual racism. They prefer to think of racism in terms of how you treat people as individuals. Well, I'm not a racist. My best friend in the Marines was a Black man. I had someone say that to me at a presentation in the last couple of years. I don't believe in the systemic racism, right? It's something for the past. Well, Robert P. Jones, in his book, White Too Long, quotes another scholar who talks about how all groups have a kind of cultural toolkit. This is a repertoire of shared ideas and behaviors that allow them to organize and interpret reality. And this toolkit acts like a filter, allowing some things to come sharply into focus while blurring other things into an indistinguishable background field. Many conservative Christians and even moderate Christians have a kind of cultural toolkit that restricts their moral vision to the personal and interpersonal realms, filtering out institutional or structural issues. They tend to see the root of all problems in individuals or in poor relationships between individuals, rather than in unfair laws or unjust institutions. So if people are poor or disadvantaged, if there is inequality in jobs or housing, it's because of individuals. I'm reminded of what Herman Cain, the founder of Domino's Pizza, several years ago, he ran for president. He said, at one point, he said, if you're poor, it's your own fault. If you're poor, it's your own fault. And a lot of conservative evangelicals like to think that, well, the problem is solely with sinful individuals. They need a change of heart. They need religious conversion. And according to Robert P. Jones, this individualistic toolkit has crept into white mainline Protestantism and white Catholicism. So many prefer to view the situation today as an equal playing field, that everyone has equal opportunity, and that if you're not successful, it must be due to some personal defect. Maybe you're lazy, maybe you don't have the requisite intelligence. Now, certainly personal deficiencies can be an important factor. But I would argue that, individuals don't live in a vacuum. This individualistic mindset often prevents Christians and many other Americans from thinking about the way institutions or even culture may limit human well-being. And again, there's a kind of racial divide on this question. There was a Pew poll done from a few years ago, which asked, when it comes to racism against Black people in our country today, the bigger problem is it racism in our laws, or is it racism by individual people? And the vast majority of Americans said, well, it's racism by individual people. But there was a significant divide between whites and Blacks. 70% of whites said, well, it's simply, racism by individual people. That's the bigger problem. Whereas 43% said it's simply, this is the bigger problem. 52% of Blacks said it's racism in our laws. And again, there's a partisan divide as well on this basic question. Now, I'm not surprised by this result. As a white person, if you've never had to experience the lingering effects of systemic racism, if you don't encounter it in your personal life, you are less likely to be aware that structural racism even exists. And if it's not being taught in the schools, then you're going to be even less aware. Well, there are many examples from our history of institutional racism. I don't need to study critical race theory to understand the numerous ways in which historical patterns of racism have been embedded in our nation's institutions, in our laws, in our policies, that create an uneven playing field for African Americans and other white minority groups. We could look at well, let me just focus on one particular example. And that's the example of wealth accumulation. We could do a study of the Homestead Acts of the mid-19th century, how in many cases, these Homestead Acts they gave plots of land out west to encourage a lot of white Americans to start settling out west. In many cases, African Americans could not have access to these provisions of the acts. What about the legacy of slavery? What about then later on sharecropping and the rise of Jim Crow and unequal education? And, even historically, at times, African Americans were even prohibited from being taught how to read, right? What about our federal housing policies in the 20th century? Often people draw attention to the policy of redlining. Well, when the federal, I'll just focus on this for just a second here. When the Federal Housing Administration was established in 1934, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This was part of his, his New Deal plan. It refused to insure mortgages in and near African-American neighborhoods. These neighborhoods were literally marked off with red lines on maps. They were considered to be too risky, or they were declining, as it were. At the same time, the FHA subsidized builders who mass-produced entire subdivisions for whites, under the provision that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. After World War II, federal home loan policies denied loans to African Americans. And this had a huge impact on wealth accumulation. There was one study from 10 years ago that concluded that 71% of white families owned their own homes, whereas only 45% of Latino families own their homes, and 41% of Black families own their homes. So there's plenty of examples of systemic racism from our nation's past that continue to impact the situation for African Americans and Latino Americans and other ethnic minorities. Now, let's be clear. To say that historical patterns of structural racism continue to impact the lives of African and Latino Americans is not to say that white people today are to blame for racism in the past. But white people should examine the legacy of racism and the ways it still impacts our society today. They have a moral responsibility to do so. Seventh, we need to resist the temptation to associate self-criticism with hatred of country. Some people have an attitude of, America, love it or leave it, as if love of country necessarily involves turning a blind eye to its faults. Or politicians often exploit well-grounded critiques of racism in American society for their own political purposes. They cynically stir up racial resentment, stoking anger in their political bases to get them to vote. Witness the anti-critical race theory propaganda campaign of the last few years, or the backlash against the 1619 Project, or the removal of library books that we're seeing to this very day. I remember, there are a lot of right-wing politicians who were saying that, well, critical race theory simply teaches school children to hate America and teaches them that white people are racist. Well, that's not true at all. But we saw those accusations over and over and over again. A genuine patriotism is willing to examine the ways we have failed to live up to our professed ideals. When we do this, we're trying to improve our country, not tear it down. It's kind of like a coach trying to make his or her team better, or a voice teacher trying to improve a singer, or an English teacher trying to improve a student's writing. To critique is not to hate. Critiquing can grow out of a posture of love. As citizens, when we critique our country, we are trying to move us to that place where it is a more perfect union. That, to me, is genuine patriotism. Eighth, we need to counter the messages of those who view we the people through ethno-religious lenses, who view the we in we the people in a way that excludes certain ethnic or religious groups, or who think white Christians are more American than others. When our Constitution says we the people, who are the we? Is it primarily white people? Are white Christians in particular most American? 8 years ago, the Pew Research firm asked Americans if they thought that being a Christian was very important to being truly American, right? So this was on the eve of the election between Trump and Clinton. And 57% of white evangelicals at the time said that being Christian was very important to being truly American. Only a third of all Americans agreed with that statement. We need to counter the authoritarian threat of white Christian nationalism. Now, I want to just define what I mean by this here, just go into a little bit of an explanation. Because white Christian nationalists are the ones who are going to be more likely to say that, well, being white and being Christian is very important to being real Americans. I would commend the book by Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. And in this book, they define white Christian nationalism as an ethno-religious political ideology or cultural framework. And as such a framework, it idealizes and advocates a fusion of American civic life with a particular type of Christian identity and culture, a particular kind of conservative type of Christian identity and culture. White Christian nationalism provides a set of ideals, values, narratives, and myths through which Americans perceive and navigate their world. And as such, it's very concerned with maintaining certain symbolic boundaries and hierarchies between distinguishing, between real Americans and nominal Americans. And they also tend to support the normative nature of patriarchy and heterosexuality. There have been plenty of studies that have shown that the higher you score on measures of white Christian nationalism, the more likely you are to endorse positions that affirm men over women, men's authority over women, or to take very negative stances towards the LGBTQ community. Now, white Christian nationalism is not to be confused with the religion of Christianity. It bears very little resemblance to the teachings of Christ and classical Christianity. It essentially uses Christian as a symbolic or cultural signifier. Andrew Whitehead has written in his recent book, American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. He has written that this essentially seeks to transform Abraham Lincoln's vision of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, into a government of a particular people, by a particular people, for a particular people. White Christian nationalism is essentially about maintaining power. It's about control. Now, our task is not to save the blatant white Christian nationalists. There's a certain segment of society that will be unwilling to give up their racist views or their views that white people ought to matter more than others. I don't think I can say anything that will convince them otherwise. But I think our task is to build a world where such views have very little air in which to breathe. Ninth, white people need to stop thinking that efforts to redress past injustices will cause them to lose out in the end. They need to stop thinking that it's some sort of zero-sum game, that if the government is targeting specific marginalized peoples to redress past injustices, that whites will lose out in the end. White people fear that a genuine democracy will mean white people will have to lose something, that they will have to give up their material and symbolic standing in the country. So in order for us to move towards a more inclusive, pluralistic future, we need to begin to consider implementing policies that remedy generations of inequities based on the lie that some people matter more based on the color of their skin. It requires centering a set of values that holds every human being as sacred. But again, there's a huge partisan divide on some of these questions. So Americans were recently asked, do you support efforts to tell the truth about the history of slavery, violence, and discrimination against racial minorities? Again, there's a broad consensus, yes, we need to tell the truth. But when they moved on to the question of, well, okay, do you support efforts to repair the damage done by past violence or discrimination against racial minorities? It was supported by most Americans still. But again, you begin to see more and more Americans kind of peeling off, saying, well, okay, I support telling the truth about the past, but I don't necessarily support doing things to repair the damage done by the past. And again, there's a huge partisan divide here. A lot of work needs to be done. 10, we need to understand how the history of white supremacy, of subjugating others beneath the norms of whiteness, has corrupted our souls, has corrupted Christianity. As Eddie Glaude says, it has disfigured us. The belief that the color of one's skin determined the relative value of an individual's life and justified the way American society was organized had dehumanized entire groups of people. But it also debased white people. As James Baldwin said, in this debasement and definition of Black people as inferior, white people debased and defined themselves. So if we treat, when white people treated their fellow human beings as mere tools for their own prosperity, as with slavery, when they treated their fellow human beings as bodies to be exploited for their own self-interest, they not only debased Black people, but they debased themselves. Or when civil rights were finally granted and Black people were treated as refuse to be discarded or incarcerated, as Glaude points out, white people debased themselves. So this value gap has also corrupted Christianity. It has led many Christians to promote hate in the name of the God of love, to enact violence in the name of the Prince of Peace. Finally, we need to actively work for a new creation of American democracy, a new founding. We need a new narrative that eliminates the value gap that I spoke of last week, right? That some people are seen to be more valuable just because of the color of the skin, right? We need a new narrative that eliminates the value gap, where some people are counted as less worthy due to the color of the skin. We need to imagine an America in the full light of its diversity. But I also think we need to be wary of easy appeals to a colorblind society. I sometimes hear from people, when I look at people, I don't see color. Or sometimes leaders say that, well, we need to have a colorblind society, or we need to enact laws that are colorblind. And they love to quote Martin Luther King Jr. in his famous I Have a Dream speech of 1963. I have a dream that one day my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That was part of MLK's vision. That was part of his dream. But he knew that we were not there yet. Yet conservative politicians often love to post memes on MLK Day that celebrate this vision of colorblindness. Then they'll often misuse King's words, they take them out of context, to advocate for the dismantling of government programs that are designed to give the racially marginalized a better chance in society. We shouldn't use MLK's words out of context to lay the claim to the belief that we have arrived in terms of a post-racial society, that race no longer matters, that we have achieved some sort of colorblindness. Too often appeals to colorblindness involves a refusal to look at the ways in which race has been constructed in America. It represents a refusal to come to terms with the experiences of ethnic minorities who have endured racial discrimination or who have suffered the consequences of systemic racism. Scholars often say that, race is a social construct. Certainly it is. But in American history, its social construction has had profound consequences for certain groups of people. And we need to recognize that without these kind of glib appeals to, well, let's just live in a colorblind society. Justice Harry Blackmun once said, a government cannot be premised on the belief that all persons are created equal when it asserts that God prefers some. In a poll from a few years ago, 65% of Americans said that the fact that the U.S. has a diverse population with people of many different races, ethnicities, religions, and backgrounds makes the country stronger. Only 9% said this diversity makes the country weaker. I wish that number was higher than 65%, but I'll work with that. And 75% of Americans agreed with the statement, it is still possible for the United States to achieve the ideal of our national motto, E pluribus unum, from many people one. I think that's all I have for you today. And so we can open it up for questions.
Peter, I'll go first just to say what a joy. I can't remember the last time I heard Harry Blackmun quoted in anything. When people ask me who's the most famous person you've ever met, I've met Jimmy Carter once, but I had a really personal conversation with Harry Blackmun in an unguarded place. So a special love that you shouted out to him. I have a microphone and I'll pass it around for questions. Anybody have any questions, comments? We've got some time. Carol Busey, you're going to have to say something because you're.
But we live in a bubble and we have to know that. We absolutely know that. We made a decision to live in a bubble here in West Nashville. Everybody in this room has been highly educated. We've been educated our children. We have made choices between public school, private school. Various choices have been made here. But, you know, one thing we tend to forget is rural Tennessee. And if you go out into any of these counties, if you've been on the board of the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts or the YMCA or any of these groups, and you go into this greater middle Tennessee region, you see a great difference in the people. And I really hate to say this here because I know I've spent so much time studying women's history, but the women's movement indirectly hurt education. And the reason is that in these rural counties, you would have Mary Smith who wanted to be the high school English teacher or high school Latin teacher. And in those days, Mary Smith had to go to Peabody here in Nashville or UT Martin or a school in East Tennessee to get an education to be a teacher. And so with the women's movement, all of those women who were going back home and being school teachers for the rest of their life in their home high school, they are now going to medical school, law school. They have more opportunities to go get MBAs, law degrees, all sorts of degrees that women did not have even in the 60s. And so I think that has made a difference. Rural Tennessee is also very, and it's clan with a C, not clan with a K. Clannish. They are tight communities of families. The worst thing that can happen to a rural family, many of you have been out in some of these counties and installed living water facilities, and you know exactly what the people are like. They don't even have clean drinking water in some of these places. But you see these clans, the worst thing that can happen to a family is that their son or daughter gets so much education, and that doesn't necessarily mean much. I mean, going to a community college would be a whole lot of education for many of these folks. And they're afraid their kids are going to leave the county. Because and they think their kids will get a better education and their kids will do better than they are doing. All of these people are white. They are poor whites. They identify themselves as Christians. They see African Americans as a threat to them. Even though there are no Black people living in these counties, it's a whole different dynamic out there. And even in other parts of Nashville, I think there's a big dynamic difference here. But we are living here in this bubble, and I dare say if there's anybody in this room who sees himself as a affirmed racist, but they also want the best for their kids. And they also, and I think if you go to a lot of schools here in town, private schools, public schools, they're going to get a very balanced education in the high school teachers. But those high school teachers now, who used to be somebody who's going to teach for 30 years, the teaching has become so hard that they want to become an assistant principal. They get a degree in administration and supervision, a master's degree, and then they want to move up the ladder. Being in the classroom is tough.
Yeah.
The parents come in and they yell at the teachers. The teachers are not respected in many schools in Tennessee. And, the teachers, they've had their fill of it. They also, they will come in wearing flip-flops, blue jeans, a t-shirt that says "See Panama City." And, that does not really attract respect. If God were here and preached one day like that, I think some people would be rolling their eyes. Enough of the soapbox.
I was thinking about Bill's law systems and, the kind of investment that they made in their life of education. And you multiply that, especially outside of a major metropolitan area. That's true, yeah. And what's that country western song? Don't get above your race. Yeah.
I was just gonna say. Has anybody watched the program about the bill? Okay. One of his comments was, I don't care how thin you make the pancake, it's too soft. And I think possibly we don't listen enough both sides and don't jump to conclusions that Democrats are bad, Republicans are good, or vice versa.
Yeah.
They all have an opinion. And to get to her point, I work for a company, manufacturing facilities. Well, we had government contracts, and the government said you have to tax if you want to have there weren't enough products in that area to satisfy that need. So, you know, we had to explain to them, we just got people down here to do that. And I think sometimes government stands in the way, and sometimes we get people that aren't qualified sometimes. That's people themselves to comment on our system that we don't educate people sufficiently.
And my hunch is, Peter, part of what you're saying is, you know, the systems of education get baked in to a lot of this as well. Yeah, you know, we're facing in a state right now, a desire to provide vouchers for everybody who can afford, you know, and it's sucking money out of the public school system to allow for that voucher system, right? So there's a cannibalization of public education. And we need to be attentive to that. If we think that public education is a high value, right? Historically, it's been. I think certainly in my own lifetime, it's been completely torpedoed, right? And you know, just personally, to your point, Carol, when we moved here, Amy's mother and sisters were public school teachers, and so Amy is very pro public schools. And we looked at some property around the church and thought, well, you know, if we want our kids to go to public schools, maybe we should move to Williamson County. Well, that's opting out, right? That's not quite the same thing. I could say we also did it because, you know, Benjamin was the smallest third grader I'd ever seen in my life, and the thought that he would be going to middle school at fifth grade in the Davidson County instead of sixth grade in the Williamson County made a difference as well. But I mean, I appreciate so much you suggesting that we live in this bubble, right? But as people in bubble, we also have an opportunity to share voices of deep concern about what's going on in our body politic. And Peter, I really appreciate you're helping us understand the difference between seeing this as a personal peccadillo having racism versus, you know, institutionalized, baked into the system. And I think so often we just think, oh golly, I played sports with, or you know, I work with, and it's all right, or you know, it's only a socioeconomic problem, right? It's if everyone looked like us and, you know, drove cars like us, there wouldn't be a problem. Well, boy, talking to friends, you know, when Henry Louis Gates, when Skip Gates can be arrested on the streets of Boston just because he's a black man walking in a neighborhood, that's a challenge that we need to be really sensitive to. And I feel I'm sort of taking over your class, Peter, and I don't mean to do that. I'm sorry. We're probably
Well, Gates got arrested for trying to get into his own home. His neighbor called the police on him.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm just looking at my watch and I realize I've got worship in 15 minutes and I'm leading.
So, thank you so much for being with us these 2 weeks. These have been really rich conversations, and
Well, thank you for inviting me. Yeah.
blessings on your work and good luck with the Hawkeyes today.
Yeah, we got, the men's game, well, the women's game is at 12 and Caitlin Clark has to score like 39 points to break the record. So that's at Nebraska. The men's game is at 2 at home. And so they're going to open up the doors early and they're going to have it on the Jumbotron, the women's game. The men's team is really bad this year. So they're going to be broadcasting Caitlin Clark on the Jumbotron, hopefully to draw crowds. And then there's some sort of football game on later today, I think. So.
Great.
So,
Grace and peace,
all the
brother.
best
Thank
to
you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.